how they're coming through Operation Overlord from the west coast, how they're coming through Operation Torch from Africa and up through Italy, and Berlin is on its way to fall here shortly. The discovery of Majdanek by the Russians and other concentration and experimentation camps is going to be the really final terms for the Third Reich on its way over there. Hitler's going to make some last-ditch efforts, and we talked about that last week with the Battle of the Bulge as well, trying to make that last offensive to really do something effectively in the war. However, that wasn't an effective offensive for him at all. It lasted about 6 weeks in winter, and then the Allies were able to turn his forces back and begin their assault full scale on Berlin. Towards the end of the war, Hitler's going to have a couple secrets up his sleeve. The Germans were incredible scientists, and they had some of the best technology in the war. Some of the things that are developed right near the end of the war is rocket power, rocket and jet engine power as well. So one of the things that would have tremendously changed the Luftwaffe's success in places like the Battle of Britain is if they had developed jet engines. All planes at this time were running off of propellers. So if you had a jet engine, you would have had a tremendous advantage. But it's developed so late in the war and it can't be mass produced that the Germans are not going to have that. The V-2 rocket is another weapon to come out late in the war. They really can't aim the thing necessarily yet, but it's this rocket propulsion that's on its way. This is modern rocket power that scientists are going to carry over into America, that are going to be developed and finding our way to the moon eventually in the 1960s. On top, there's the B-1 rocket. So there's the B-1 and the B-2. That sound you heard when this slide came on was a buzz. And they made this kind of clucking, buzzing noise as they flew across from Germany over the English Channel. So basically, he'd take that big yellow-looking buzz bomb right there, and he'd lob those suckers over the English Channel into London. And he really couldn't aim them in particular, so they would hit pretty much indiscriminate targets, whether it's a hospital, whether it's a children's preschool, whether it's a military target, whether it's an oil plant, whatever that may be. Werner von Braun, on my right here, is probably the most famous German scientist. We're going to move several German scientists over to America. Werner von Braun's going to come over, and he's an important name to remember. He's going to develop a large amount of the modern rocket propulsion technology that's eventually going to be used by NASA and eventually going to be used in the space race against the Soviets. That's Werner von Braun. So as the Russians close in on Germany, they head their way towards what's called the Pier bunker. Okay? Hitler's going to commit suicide. He never lives to actually face the penalties of what he did. Inside of this bunker, there's several high-ranking Nazi officials. There's a very good movie about this that came out just recently in the last 5-10 years. That's a fantastic portrayal of what may have happened inside of that bunker. Hitler was married to a woman named Eva Braun, who was really a famous actress inside of Germany. And him and his wife are going to commit suicide inside of that bunker. So the bunker is deep and underground and really protected from any assaults on it by the Germans or the Russians. And they were shelling and shooting artillery at this thing during the whole time. The method of suicide is going to be to swallow a cyanide capsule, and often cyanide capsules were kept in little glass capsules. They take that capsule, they place it in the back of their jaw and their teeth here, and then they bite down on that, releasing the poison into their system. Within a matter of seconds, it would stop them from breathing and would attack their nervous system to eventually kill them. You may remember that in World War I, Gavrilo Princip tried to kill himself using a cyanide capsule too. It was just the cyanide. So additionally, as a safety factor to the cyanide capsules potentially not working, they're also going to use a pistol to shoot themselves as well. And they aren't the only ones. The Goering family kills themselves and their children while they're inside of there. They viewed surrendering at this time as something that would be dishonoring Germany. Hitler during this time period viewed any of his generals who had surrendered in various circumstances on the western and the eastern fronts inside of Europe as surrendering and showing weakness, and that they shouldn't have been doing that. He was outraged by that as well. One of the great travesties of World War I is that Hitler will not be prosecuted or brought to justice for the millions of people of deaths that he caused because he takes the easy route out and commits suicide as the Americans and Germans are knocking on his doorstep. So, VE Day is a term you should know, and it's really easy to remember. VE Day is Victory in Europe Day, and you're going to see this across newspapers all the way from Bismarck and Minot, North Dakota, to New York and to Los Angeles, as the newspapers come out declaring that the Allies have had victory in Europe, okay? There's going to be an official surrender. That surrender is not done by Hitler, obviously, because Hitler's dead, but by General Keitel, who's going to assign the official papers and the official surrendering to the Allied soldiers. You won't need to know Keitel's name. So if you're an American, you're pumped. Your kids who are training to go to war might not have to go to war, although the Pacific War is still going on. That Europe's finally over. This war where you've lost potentially cousins, fathers, brothers, sons, is finally coming to an end, and the Third Reich is no longer going to rule over them. A couple largely untold stories that are worth mentioning here that I won't go into extreme detail on are about the code breakers of World War II. Bletchley Park, in the top right up there, is the British code-breaking machine. So this is where the British officers work to break the codes of the German soldiers. The German soldiers and the Japanese have their own different codes, and those machines were made and put out in different ways. So the Germans had what was called the German Enigma machine. And the Enigma machine would take written statements in German and put them out into a numbered coding that was then used on another Enigma machine to enter the numbered coding and then come out as a written statement in German again. So these Enigma machines, you had to have the machine to break the code essentially. And America is going to make several efforts to get a couple of Enigma machines and to break the code in the process of it, in addition to the mathematicians at Bletchley Park trying to break the code as well. One of the more famous movies in Hollywood about the Enigma machine is called U-571. U-571 is about a submarine that goes to capture one of these Enigma machines, although it's really late in the war, and we already had a couple at that time. The Japanese had what was called the Purple Code machine. I don't have as much to say about this one, because it's very similar to the Enigma machine, and the premise for it is very similar as well. But understand that a large type of intelligence warfare is going on in addition to people fighting and dying inside of the different fronts of Europe. This leads us to the Pacific Theater. The first couple slides here are going to be about Pearl Harbor, and I believe, if I remember correctly, my very first one after I click here is an audio clip that's going to go through a couple different things. You're going to hear FDR talking over the top about some of the things that happened during the time period and actual radio broadcasts that he listened to. So we're not going to cover Pearl Harbor in depth here today, guys, because it's going to largely be covered in U.S. history 2 years from now.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air, President Roosevelt has just announced. The attack also was made on all naval and military activities on the principal island of Oahu.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with that nation, and at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific.
So, write down Pearl Harbor in your notes, please. And I'll give you a couple comments about what happened. I'm not going to tell the entire story, as I said. We'll save that for U.S. history. We'll get under here 2 years ahead of time. But Pearl Harbor is the event that gets America involved in the war. We did not know it was going to happen. It was a surprise attack by the Japanese. That's usually done for a couple of reasons, which you should write down, because that's the most common question I get from ninth graders every year, is why did they attack us? We weren't even in the war. It's 1941. We haven't even attacked anyone. You got to realize now, I just stepped back 3 years in the war to when we are getting attacked by Japan. So 44 is when we invade Europe, 41 is when we're initially attacked. So Number one, the Japanese believed we were going to enter the war no matter what. You're going to have to paraphrase this. They believed we're going to enter the war no matter what. And since we were going to do that, it was kind of a get them before they get us mentality. They believed that if they could cripple our Pacific fleet and the ships we actually had inside of the country, that then maybe, just maybe, they would be able to fight a successful war against the United States. They knew that we had a much more powerful Navy, and we were a way bigger industrial giant, and there was going to be no way to necessarily compete with us in a full-scale war. So when they attack us, they're going to go for a couple of major objectives. Our oil wells, our battleships, and our aircraft carriers. They will not get our aircraft carriers, they will not get our oil wells, they will get any of our battleships, but because of that, it's not considered a success for them. They destroy a lot of stuff, they destroy a lot of planes too, but it's not necessarily a success because they didn't get those carriers and they didn't get those oil wells. Number two, we actually had tried to make somewhat of an alliance with Japan. But then because Japan, if you remember, invaded an area called Manchuria and invaded another area inside of China, and eventually invaded the capital city of China, because they did that, the United States put sanctions on them, and the League of Nations put sanctions on them, and we wouldn't sell them oil. We wouldn't sell them the materials, the raw materials they needed to make a war fleet and to make a war machine. And because of that, Japan knows they're running low on these materials, and they're somewhat angry that we won't trade with them. So those sanctions we put on them are another primary cause of Pearl Harbor and them attacking us. This brings us to the Pacific Theater. We'll point out a couple things on this map. Here's Hawaii, right up top here. Hawaii was not within striking distance of Japan. There's no way during this time period you can fly a plane from Hawaii to Japan. So in order for America to get close enough to attack Japan, we've got to get somewhere in this region to different islands in the Pacific, hold different islands, build airstrips, or take over airstrips that are already on there by the Japanese, and then move close enough to Japan to actually attack them. So we're eventually going to get into this Guam, Okinawa area, kind of near the Philippines and Iwo Jima, and once we're right over here, we can actually attack them. And it's going to take us a couple years to get there. So we're going to initially kind of strike back at them, which I'll talk about here in a moment. But the Pacific Theater becomes one of naval warfare, of air warfare, and of this a theme of us hopping from island to island, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now listen as closely as you can to the recording on this next slide, please.
Greetings, everybody. This is your number one enemy, your favorite playmate or command, a radio dopey. The little somebody whose throat you like to cut. We're ready again for a vicious assault on your morale. 75 minutes of music and news for our friends, I mean our enemies in the South Pacific.
This woman is Tokyo Rose. You can Google her, and you can write a couple things about her in your notes. She's a propagandist. She is the Chinese, or the Japanese propagandist. Tokyo Rose, there were a couple women that did it, but the main one was actually educated in the United States, which is why she spoke English. Believe it or not, that was English you heard her speaking right now. And what she did was she operated on the radio. She held a radio program that targeted American morale. Now let's type in the word morale. I'll spell it for you, and let's type in define morale. M-O-R-A-L-E. So define morale. M-O-R-A-L-E. Everyone who has a computer should do that. Probably insert a definition into your notes for morale. So what she did though was she played music that was popular in America. She talked about soldiers' sweethearts and their wives and their kids. And she talked about how you must miss them so much and it must hurt you to be over here in the Pacific fighting against the Japanese. And then she played songs that made them think of home. So Tokyo Rose targeted American morale. She was a specialist, if you will, in mental warfare. In other words, she targeted how soldiers felt. She targeted how they felt about the war. She wanted to make them feel soft and weak so they couldn't fight and do the jobs they needed to do on the various islands and the Japanese. You can look up another one. The Germans had their version of Tokyo Rose. She was called Axis Sally. And she did essentially the same things. She attacked American morale and tried to defeat them mentally so their will to fight was lessened when they engaged themselves in battle with the Japanese or with the Germans, respectively. Another soundbite here.
Today, bonds of freedom, that's what I'm selling in bonds today. Scrape up the most you can, here comes the freedom man, asking you to buy a share of freedom today. Penny stamps today, we'll be blessed if we all invest in the USA. Oh, here comes the freedom man, can't make tomorrow's plan, not unless you buy a share of freedom today.
Write war bonds down in the notes. War bonds are important concepts, not just for America, but for all nations. War bonds funded the war. You can't fight a war if you don't have the money to do it. And World War II is largely fought 50% by money funded by the government and 50% funded by you guys, the American citizens. What they did is they went and they sold bonds. They had huge, enormous bond drives. They did them at baseball games, they did them at football games, and they went out and they sold these things to get Americans to buy them. Now, a bond is something that when you buy it, you're promised to get X amount of money back. Some of you guys might have savings bonds in certain banks, okay? It's the same principle. The only difference with a war bond is the government allocating that money to go specifically to the war effort. So millions and millions of dollars are going to be spent on the war here, and millions of those dollars came from American citizens buying bonds. Soldiers came back who had been war heroes, who had done something special in this battle or that battle, and they took part of these bond drives, and they tried to raise these funds to continue the war. Betty Grable up top here becomes kind of a sex symbol of this time period, okay? I think it's really interesting when you look at somebody like from this time period. This would be considered a very dicey picture compared to what you guys see in the media every day and images that you guys are hit with. There's been some huge culture changes inside of America from that time period to this time period. But as it says, it reminded men what they were fighting for. So you got two kinds of battles going on right here. You have a battle by Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally to come at the Americans and weaken their will to fight. And then you also have the Americans who are holding things like RSO shows to raise American morale, to keep their spirits up, to remind them you're fighting for America, you're fighting for people like